The Cress Theory?
The Cress Theory.
Well, the Cress Theory is a thesis about racism, white supremacy. And as I was explaining earlier, I got involved in this thinking when I was doing residency in general psychiatry at St. Elizabeth's Hospital and encountering black patients that essentially had been cast to the side. We're not really interested in the black patient. We're interested in other kinds of patients, namely white patients. And I don't think that is uncommon, as we look back on our historic experience, that people were not zeroing in and being interested. I mean, one could translate that today when we have a lot of black young people, young male people who are getting into difficulty with drugs and guns. And nobody looks at them and says, I wonder why these children are having these problems. They just lump it in the category of being bad and crime-ridden. Do you see? So that same attitude was what prevailed generally when I began training in psychiatry. And so I started, wait a minute, I'm a third-generation physician in my family. My father was a physician. His father was a physician. And I grew up with the attitude that your responsibility as a physician is to address the medical and health needs of your people, people like yourself. Not that you would exclude anybody, but your priority responsibility. And so I, started talking to black patients in a psychiatric hospital, and I became impressed by the fact that racism was causing great distress in these lives. I mean, the patient wouldn't say, I'm being impacted, doctor, by racism. But they would describe what they had experienced, do you see, and understanding, well, this is a product of racism. So that racism was causing depression, causing drug use, and other kinds of problems that patients face. And so I said, let me understand it. To myself, I have to understand this if I'm going to really be effective as a physician. I mean, an effective physician doesn't just, the patient has a cough. The patient is depressed, and write that down in your notes and give some medication. An effective physician, in my viewpoint, is a scientist who will say, what is causing this? Because only when you say, what is the etiology, what is the causation, can you move towards curing the problem, and most importantly, preventing it from going forward. And so I was looking for this answer, and had the very good fortune of meeting Mr. Neely Fuller, Neely Fuller Jr., who is a citizen of the District of Columbia. And he, on his own, I met him following a Black Power committee meeting. That's back in the 60s, 1967 to be exact. And he was a person attending a meeting who, after I met him, I realized that he had been writing about this topic of racism going back to the Korean War when he was a soldier in the Korean War. And he said on a radar site in Japan, he started thinking about what was happening in the area of the world that we call the United States around the issue of color. And he started putting together his ideas. And when I met him and heard him talk about racism as a global system of power, where persons who classify themselves as white would maintain power over people who they classify as the non-whites, meaning the black, brown, red, and yellow people. And he said the system was operative in all areas of activity: economics, education, entertainment, labor, law, politics, religion, sex, and war. And so that just blew my mind. I said, wow, that seems to be a very, very important idea. And after talking with him over a period of time, I started thinking, but why? Do you see? In other words,
why would they do this?
This is a new description of a very critical phenomenon on the planet Earth. I say that racism is the most important phenomenon that anybody can investigate and study. Not for the purpose of putting anyone down, but again, scientifically. This is a critical phenomenon that is impacting the lives of the vast majority of people on this planet in a negative way. And so we're going to have justice on the planet, so therefore we can have peace. Somebody has to probe deeply. and understand this problem. And so he had outlined this system. And I guess as a psychiatrist who's always wondering further about the why of behavior, so I thought, well, this seems to describe what I have experienced in my travels in the world, that you don't get away from racism. Racism is everywhere. If you go to Europe, it's there. If you go to Mexico, it's there. What would cause it? And that's how I got into my work, the Cress Theory, by going, I would say, I don't want to say deeper, but going to another level. Because Mr. Fuller, and this is his book, the textbook for victims of white supremacy.
Dynamic book, I must say.
A most powerful and dynamic book. And so I worked with him from 1967 to 1984 so that we could publish this book. And, that was even something interesting. If somebody said, you'll work with this gentleman 17 years to make certain that his work is published, I would not have believed it at the time, but I was so impacted by the significance of what he had to say that I said, this has to be published. So we went through a number of twists and turns to bring it about, and it was a trip that took 17 years. But now the book is published, and I consider it to be one of the most important books of the 20th century. And my work just said, well, why would behavior be organized in this way, do you see, with white over non-white, or a tiny minority over the majority people on the planet? And I came up with the paper that's entitled The Cress Theory of Color Confrontation. Cress is my maiden name. I was married